All right, so get ready. We're about to go deep into some really fascinating stuff and honestly kind of controversial territory today.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about how the media shapes the way we see, like, history and what's happening in the world right now, especially when it comes to big newspapers like the New York Times.
Okay, I'm listening.
So you sent us some pieces from Noam Chomsky's book, Letters from Lexington, Reflections on Propaganda.
That's a good one.
And, well, this book, it really makes you think, like seriously think.
Oh, I know Chomsky. He definitely pushes you to think critically, that's for sure. Like about all the information, all the news and stuff that we're bombarded with every single day, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And he's especially critical of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah,
You know, how the media often presents things in a very particular way, sometimes maybe even a bit sanitized.
I see what you mean.
So as we go through this deep dive, it's super important to remember we're approaching this with open minds, like ready to unpack some of these really complex ideas and consider different perspectives.
Absolutely.
You might find yourself agreeing with Chomsky, disagreeing, or maybe somewhere in between.
Right, right. That's kind of the point, you know? That's what critical thinking is all about, like looking at things from different sides and then figuring out what you believe based on, well, all that information.
Exactly. Okay, so one of the big ideas Chomsky talks about is this idea of defensive aggression.
Defensive aggression, huh?
And I know it kind of sounds contradictory, right?
Yeah, at first.
But it's actually a really powerful way to understand how countries, especially powerful ones, justify their actions in the world.
Makes you think of that saying, like, the best defense is a good offense or something like that, but like on a way bigger scale.
Yes, exactly. So how does this defensive aggression thing actually play out in, real world situations?
Good question. Well, Chomsky uses the U.S. invasion of Panama back in 1989 as a prime example.
Okay, so what happened there?
All right, so you have Manuel Noriega, who was in charge of Panama at the time. Now, he was no angel, but the U.S. made him out to be this huge danger to, like, national security, you know?
To justify going in.
Right. But if you look closer, you start to see the actual threat level. It was probably exaggerated, like way exaggerated.
Did you serve U.S. interests?
You got it. It's all about controlling how the story gets told. You know what I mean?
Okay, so it's not just about whether there's a threat, but about how that threat is presented.
Yeah, and how loud they shout about it.
Amplified to get the public on board with military action.
Exactly. It's fascinating, right? When you start to think about how politicians and the media talk about these conflicts, you can really see elements of defensive aggression at work.
Yeah, you start to notice it everywhere.
It's a whole new way of looking at things. Now, another thing Chomsky really challenges is how we see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, that's a big one.
He argues that the U.S. media hasn't been honest about the history of this conflict. Like, they've downplayed or even completely ignored efforts made by Palestinians for peace.
He calls it the Middle East lie.
Exactly. He's got strong opinions about how the media creates this twisted view of what's going on.
Strong opinions is an understatement. So can you give us an example of this Middle East lie in action?
Sure. He talks about the 1971 Allen Plan. It was this proposal from Israel that basically said, okay, Palestinians, you can have a little bit of self-governance, but we're still calling the shots.
It's not really a genuine offer.
Not even close. The Palestinians said no, of course. And Chomsky's point is this rejection, along with other peace efforts from Palestinians, have been, like, swept under the rug by mainstream media.
They just don't talk about it.
Exactly. So think about it. If you're only getting half the story,
Alas.
how can you even begin to form a real opinion?
Yeah, like who's really responsible for the lack of peace in the region?
It's a huge question, especially in such a complex and often emotionally charged conflict, right?
Oh, yeah. So it sounds like it's so important to be aware of those potential biases in how the media covers things.
Totally. And to look for different perspectives, not just take one side's word for it.
For sure, for sure. So Chomsky also dives into how the media uses the word terrorism.
That's an interesting one.
It's almost like we all have a feeling instinctively about what terrorism is.
Yeah, we think we know it when we see it.
But how does that compare to how it's actually used?
Right, right. Chomsky points out that the U.S. and its allies, they often get a pass when it comes to terrorism, even when they do things that hurt civilians.
Even when they cause a lot of casualties.
Exactly. Like, there's a double standard for sure, where violence on our side is seen as, okay, justified, while violence on their side is automatically evil.
Who gets to decide who's the terrorist?
Right. He gives some pretty disturbing examples, too, like how Israel bombed Palestinian refugee camps.
And the U.S. media was pretty quiet about that.
Yeah, they often downplayed it or even tried to justify it. Chomsky makes you think about who benefits from this, from labeling some groups as terrorists while others get a free pass.
Whose interests are really being served? Okay, that's a really challenging question, and there's probably not an easy answer.
I don't think there is.
Yeah.
But we have to at least think about it, you
Right.
know, like how the media shapes how we see these complicated issues. And we have to be critical of what we're being told.
Not just accept it.
Exactly. Okay, so another interesting case Chomsky brings up is the 1990 Nicaraguan elections.
Okay, yeah, I know he says those elections weren't actually free or fair,
Nope, not at all.
even though the U.S. presented them as a big win for democracy.
Right, but here's the thing. The U.S. was doing some pretty messed up things to the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, like think economic warfare and even some terror tactics.
Wait, the Sandinistas, weren't they like socialists?
Exactly. And the U.S. saw them as a threat. So all this pressure from the U.S., it created an atmosphere of fear, and that definitely influenced the elections.
So it wasn't just about the actual voting, but about what was happening around it.
The whole context.
Right.
And the U.S. media, well, they often left that part out or just presented a very, very cleaned up version of events.
Oh, wow.
Chomsky's using this example, the Nicaraguan elections, to show a bigger point, though, about how U.S. democracy, well, how it doesn't always work the way we think it should.
Yeah, he's saying people don't have as much power as we think.
Especially when it comes to foreign policy and the media. They help to keep things that way by, quieting anyone who disagrees and reinforcing the way things are.
Wow. It's really making me think about who really holds the power here and how they control what we think about democracy itself.
Exactly. And get this, Chomsky even compares the U.S. media to what it was like in the USSR under Brezhnev.
Wait, what?
Yeah, he's suggesting that both systems, even though they were so different on the surface, had similar ways of, controlling what people thought and silencing anyone who didn't agree.
That's a bold statement.
Yeah.
So how does he justify that?
Well, he says that both in the U.S. and the USSR, there was a very narrow range of acceptable opinions.
So, only certain things you were allowed to say.
Right, and if you stepped outside of those boundaries, there were consequences. Have you ever noticed how some viewpoints are just, constantly made fun of or pushed to the side in the media?
Yeah, actually.
Chomsky would say that's a type of thought control, whether they're doing it on purpose or not.
So it's not like they're banning certain ideas outright, but they're creating an environment where those ideas are just not allowed.
Exactly.
So who decides what's okay to talk about and what's not?
That's a good question, one we should all be asking. Okay, so have you ever thought about the power of what's not said, like what's missing from the story? Chomsky calls this toxic omissions, and it's pretty interesting.
Okay, I'm curious. What does he mean by that?
Think of it like a magic trick, right?
Okay.
They're showing you something flashy to distract you from what they're hiding.
Oh, so by leaving out certain facts or perspectives, the media can shape how you see things without actually lying.
That's exactly it. It's sneaky, but it's powerful, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, for example, Chomsky talks about how the media was basically silent about the U.S. trying to destabilize Costa Rica back in the 80s.
Costa Rica. Why them?
Well, Costa Rica had a democratic system, and their social programs were actually working pretty well.
Oh, so they were a good example.
Right.
Yeah.
But highlighting their success would have made the U.S. look bad. It would have challenged their whole story about, this supposed communist threat in Latin America.
They needed a bad guy.
Basically. So by leaving out the stuff that doesn't fit the narrative, the media can shape public opinion without ever actually telling a lie. Pretty crazy, right?
It's like they're choosing what we see and don't see.
Exactly. And it makes it even more important to be critical of what we read and hear and to search out different sources of information.
Yeah, to get the full picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about defensive aggression, the Middle East lie, this double standard on terrorism, and toxic emissions.
We've covered a lot.
I feel like I need to go back and reread all this just to fully understand it.
That's how Chomsky gets you.
Yeah.
He sparks this need to think critically, to go beyond just accepting what you read.
Yeah, he definitely makes you think.
And that's a good thing, right? Yeah, it definitely does. He throws a grenade in your brain and makes you question everything.
Seriously. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, Chomsky also talks about the U.S. and the United Nations, and he makes this kind of funny comparison. He's like, the U.S. is like that kid on the playground who, only wants to follow the rules when it benefits them.
Uh-huh. I know exactly the type you're talking about, always trying to get away with something. So how does that play out with the U.S. and the UN on, like, the world stage?
Well, Chomsky points out that the U.S. is pretty quick to praise the UN and, use it to its advantage when it aligns with their interests. But then they'll totally undermine it or ignore it when it doesn't.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, for example, he talks about how the U.S. media was all about praising the UN during the Gulf War. Right? But then they completely ignored all those years that the U.S. was fighting against UN resolutions on things like Palestine.
So it's like the UN is only good when it's doing what the U.S. wants it to do.
Pretty much. It makes you wonder, how sincere the U.S. really is about cooperating with other countries.
I see what you mean. It's like, are they really committed to this idea of global cooperation? Or is it just, a tool they can use when it's convenient?
Right. Okay, and speaking of selective praise, Chomsky also criticizes how the media downplays all those times Israel has broken UN resolutions and international law.
Yeah, especially in the occupied territories.
Yeah. It's like there's this pattern where the U.S. is like really quick to get outraged about certain things, but then they totally look the other way when it comes to their allies doing like basically the same stuff.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme with Chomsky. Like, he's always pointing out this double standard.
Totally. Okay, so this kind of ties into another critique he makes, which is about how the media portrays the U.S. as this, like, peaceful force in the Middle East.
The peacemaker? Yeah, I've had that one before.
But Chomsky says that this image is completely at odds with, what the U.S. actually does in the region.
So it's all just for show.
Pretty much.
So what evidence does he have to back that up?
Well, he argues that the U.S. has consistently blocked real peace efforts in the Middle East.
Why would they do that?
Because those efforts would have threatened Israel's control in the region. Like, for example, he talks about how the U.S. refused to support an international peace conference back in the 90s.
Was that, like, a big deal?
Oh, yeah. Almost every country in the world wanted this conference to happen, even U.S. allies.
And the U.S. just said no?
Yep.
Wow.
But here's the thing. The U.S. media spun this as, like, the U.S. taking a brave stand against terrorism and extremism.
It's amazing how they can just twist things like that with just by changing a few words.
Seriously. So Chomsky also takes issue with how the media has portrayed Palestinian leaders, like Yasser Arafat. He says they've made him out to be this, like, inherently unreasonable guy who just doesn't want peace.
So they're painting him as the bad guy.
Exactly. And by doing that, they create this narrative where Israel is the victim and the Palestinians are the aggressors.
It's about controlling the story, right? Like, it's not just about reporting on what's happening, but about shaping how people see the whole conflict over time.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on, Chomsky also talks about the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq after the Gulf War.
Yeah.
And he's really critical of how the U.S. media pretty much ignored all the suffering that those sanctions caused.
Oh, right. The focus was all on Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, he was the big bad guy.
But what about the people, like regular Iraqis?
Exactly. They couldn't even get basic things like food and medicine. And the media just didn't really talk about it.
It's scary to think about how easily people can forget about the human cost of these political decisions.
Yeah, like the real people who are affected by these policies.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all the political talk and forget about the human side of things.
Totally. Okay, now this is interesting. Chomsky also talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union and how the U.S. media celebrated it as this, huge victory for democracy and freedom.
Oh, yeah, like the good guys won.
Right. It was a big moment in history, for sure. But Chomsky argues that this whole narrative was way too simplistic. Like, it ignored all the complex stuff that was actually going on.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, while the Soviet Union was collapsing, the U.S. was actually getting more involved in military actions around the world.
So one enemy goes down and a bunch of new ones pop up.
Exactly. And the media just seamlessly switched its focus to these new threats, They were mostly in the third world.
And that justified more military spending.
And more interventionist policies.
So was the U.S. really all about spreading democracy and freedom? Or was it more about, like, expanding their own power in this new world order?
That's a really good question, and it's one that we should all be asking ourselves. Okay, so let's talk about Cuba. Chomsky is really critical of the U.S. media for always blaming Cuba's economic problems on Fidel Castro and his communist regime.
And ignoring the embargo.
Exactly. It's like blaming someone for being poor when you're the one who's, cutting off their access to resources and opportunities.
Doesn't seem very fair.
It's not. And get this, Chomsky quotes this guy from a big U.S. think tank, and this guy actually argued that the collapse of the Soviet Union made U.S. military power even more useful as a tool for, getting their way in foreign policy.
So basically, might makes right.
It's a pretty scary way of looking at the world. It's like saying that the only way to solve problems is through violence.
Yeah, like the diplomacy and cooperation are out the window.
And this ties into Chomsky's bigger point about how the media portrayed the Cold War, this fight between two totally opposite ways of thinking. He says this framing basically shut down any other perspectives or any kind of disagreement.
So anyone who criticized U.S. foreign policy was just labeled as, like, a communist.
Or a traitor, yeah. It was a way to silence people and prevent any real debate from happening.
So, like, even if you had legitimate concerns about what the U.S. was doing, you couldn't really speak up without being attacked.
Right. And Chomsky uses the Vietnam War as a perfect example of this. The media kept saying it was a fight for freedom and democracy, even though, the war was brutal and based on lies.
It's like they were helping to convince people to support a war that was built on a foundation of deception.
That's exactly what Chomsky argues. And to prove his point about the real intentions behind U.S. foreign policy, he brings up this secret memo from the Eisenhower administration from 1960.
The secret memo, what did it say?
Basically, it outlined the goal of getting rid of Castro in Cuba and replacing him with someone who was, more friendly to the U.S.
Regime change. Talk about proof.
It really shows you what they were really after, right? It was about controlling other countries and making sure they aligned with U.S. interests, even if it meant overthrowing a democratically elected leader.
It's a little disturbing when you think about it.
It is. Okay, so Chomsky also talks about how the media handled William Gates when he was nominated to be CIA director.
Gates, the Microsoft guy.
Not that Gates. This was a different William Gates. But instead of focusing on his views on foreign policy, which were pretty disturbing, the media just focused on his personality, like his quirks and stuff.
So they turned it into a personality piece.
Pretty much. And Chomsky highlights this memo that Gates wrote back in 1984, where he basically said the U.S. should be the boss in the Western Hemisphere and get rid of any regimes they don't like.
Rid the continent. What strong wording.
Right. And to give you some historical context, Chomsky brings up a quote from Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. This guy basically said that the U.S. only cares about other countries in the Americas when it benefits them.
So the U.S. has been meddling in the affairs of other countries in the Americas for a long time.
Yep, over a century. It's not a new thing. And this helps to understand why Chomsky is so critical of how the media reacted to the Haitian coup.
Right, because the U.S. condemned the coup, but then they were also okay with the outcome.
Exactly. Like, they didn't like how it happened, but they were fine with the military junta being in charge instead of Aristide, the democratically elected president.
So they were condemning the process, but not the result.
It's pretty messed up when you think about it. But the U.S. government and the media saw Aristide as a threat because he was fighting for the poor and trying to make things more just.
It's like anyone who actually tries to change the system and help the people is seen as an enemy.
Yeah, that's a pretty common theme you see in a lot of Chomsky's work. And it's not just the news either. Chomsky points out that even things like book reviews can be used to shape people's opinions and reinforce what's considered acceptable.
Book reviews, really?
Yep. He talks about this review of a book about the Middle East, where the reviewer basically dismissed any criticism of U.S. policy as just being anti-American.
Oh, come on. It's like saying you can't criticize your own country, right?
Exactly. It's a way to shut down any real discussion and prevent people from disagreeing.
So much for freedom of speech, I guess.
Right. It's like they're avoiding the actual criticism by just dismissing it as unpatriotic or something. Now, Chomsky also talks about this idea of political correctness and how the media uses it to, basically silence important conversations about race, gender, and inequality.
That's a really sensitive topic, isn't it? Like, everyone has such strong opinions about it.
Yeah, totally. So what Chomsky's saying is that the media makes it seem like political correctness is this huge threat to free speech, but they ignore all the systemic problems that make these conversations so important in the first place.
So it's more about the words people use than the actual issues they're trying to talk about.
Exactly. He argues that the media is obsessed with this idea of political correctness because it distracts people from the real problems and helps to keep things the way they are.
Oh, so it's like a smokescreen, right, to cover up the bigger issues.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, let's not talk about the actual problems. Let's just argue about what words we're allowed to use. It's totally a distraction.
It is. It's a way to shut down the conversation before it even really starts. You know, remember that comparison Chomsky made between the U.S. media and the media in the USSR under Brezhnev?
Yeah, that was a pretty crazy comparison.
It was, wasn't it? But he actually goes even deeper into that in this section.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that. How does he explain it?
Well, he argues that both systems, even though they had completely different beliefs, right, they had some really striking similarities in how they controlled information and silenced people who disagreed with them.
So even in the U.S., which is supposed to be this free and open society, there are still these, like, limits on what you can say.
Exactly. Like there are these invisible boundaries.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And if you cross those boundaries, you risk being labeled as like a radical or a conspiracy theorist or even unpatriotic.
So it's not like you're going to get arrested or anything, but you're going to be ostracized, right?
Exactly. Chomsky gives some pretty disturbing examples of how dissidents in both the U.S. and the USSR were, you know, basically shut out, discredited, and sometimes even punished for challenging the official narrative.
Wow. It's kind of scary when you think about it, like how much control these power structures have over what we think and believe.
It is, and it makes it even more important for us to, you know, be aware of these forces and to actively seek out different perspectives.
Don't just accept everything you hear.
Right, question everything. And Chomsky suggests that a lot of this filtering of information happens through self-censorship.
Self-censorship, what do you mean?
Like journalists and editors, they internalize these boundaries. They know what they can and can't say, and they know how to frame things in a way that fits the accepted narrative.
It's like they're censoring themselves without even realizing it.
It's subtle, but it's definitely there.
Okay, so Chomsky also talks about historical fabrication, which basically means like how the media shapes our understanding of history, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's saying that history is not just a neutral collection of facts, it's a story. And that story is always told from a certain point of view.
And that point of view often reflects the biases and agendas of whoever's in power.
Exactly. Chomsky gives some really good examples of how the U.S. media has, you know, kind of cleaned up or downplayed or even completely erased certain events from history, especially events that make the U.S. look bad.
Oh, so like they're rewriting history to make themselves look good.
It's more like selectively editing it, choosing what parts to highlight and what parts to leave out.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. He talks about how the U.S. has overthrown democratically elected governments, supported dictators, and committed atrocities in the name of national security. But these things are often ignored, reframed, or just completely left out of the mainstream historical narrative.
It's almost like they're trying to create a fictionalized version of history.
It's a very curated version of history, for sure.
Okay, so Chomsky's basically saying that we need to be more critical of how history is presented to us and try to get a more accurate and complete picture of what really happened.
Exactly. He's challenging us to dig deeper, to question the official narrative, and to seek out alternative sources of information.
To get the full story.
Right. Because history is not just about remembering the past. It's also about understanding the present and shaping the future.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's fair to say that Chomsky is a pretty controversial figure. He's definitely not afraid to criticize the U.S. government and the media.
He's definitely not afraid to speak his mind. But I think that's what makes his work so important. Whether you agree with him or not, he forces us to think critically about the world around us and to question the information we're being given.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway from all of this. So, if we accept that the media has this much power to shape how we see the world, what responsibility do we have as consumers of information?
That's the big question, isn't it? Chomsky would say that we need to be active, engaged, and skeptical consumers of information. Like, don't just passively absorb what you're being told.
Question everything.
Exactly. Cross-check information, look for different sources, and be aware of your own biases. It's a lifelong process of critical thinking and self-reflection.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from defensive aggression to toxic emissions to historical fabrication, and it's a lot to think about. But I think we've all come away from this with a better understanding of how the media works and how it can influence our perception of the world.
Yeah, I think so too. And hopefully, we've also gained a deeper appreciation for the importance of critical thinking and independent inquiry.
Don't just believe everything you read or hear.
Question everything.
Well said. That's a great note to end on.
Ugh.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and keep those critical thinking caps on.